Upon the death of Huayna Capac, the great conquering Inca, the last of the great conquering trio of Sapa Incas, when he died, he left his empire to his son, Huascar. So Huascar was duly recognized as the next great Sapa Inca way down in the south in Cusco, in the capital. Meanwhile, here in the north, in the far north of the Inca Empire, someone else was in charge, another one of Huayna Capac's sons, Huascar's brother. He had fought and helped extend the empire here. He commanded the loyalty of the troops here. He commanded the loyalty of some of the empire's greatest generals here. So he had a veteran army. And here he was up north, number one. His name was Atahualpa. When Atahualpa was summoned to Cusco to make obeisance to his brother as Sapa Inca, Atahualpa refused to go. Instead, he sent messengers bearing gifts. Those messengers were promptly mutilated and sent back to Atahualpa in women's clothing. Atahualpa knew at that point that to go back to Cusco meant death. And so, on the advice of his generals, he declared independence. The northern part of the Inca Empire, essentially today's Ecuador, would be an independent kingdom, the kingdom of Quito, with himself as king. Sort of natural, since during the reign of Huayna Capac before, Quito had sort of been his preferred unofficial capital. So a rivalry had developed between Cusco, the real capital, and Quito, the seemingly preferred capital. Now that rivalry produced two different states. Well, it took Huascar a few years to organize a military response to these developments, but eventually he did, rounding up a massive conscript army and marching them north, or at least ordering them to march north. Commanding them was one of his most trusted generals. Atahualpa was briefly captured, but he did escape, and ultimately the two massive armies, Atahualpa's veteran army and Huascar's mostly conscript army, met here at the volcano of Chimborazo. There it is. One of the great volcanoes on earth. Look at that mountain. Right here they met in pitched battle. And in the end, Atahualpa's forces obliterated Huascar's forces. The Sapa Inca's army had been roundly defeated. To celebrate his victory, Atahualpa piled up the bodies of about 20,000 of his vanquished foes, described as skeletons. I don't know what he did to them, but piled them up in a sort of victory memorial. And unfortunately for Huascar's gifted general, he'd been captured. He was skinned, his skin pulled tight into drums, and his skull was turned into a drinking goblet that, according to later chroniclers, Atahualpa was still apparently using when the Spanish showed up a few years later. Now this victory here at Chimborazo, this changed Atahualpa, it seems to have. No longer is he content with being the king of Quito, the king of the kingdom of Quito. Now he has bigger ambitions. He wants it all. He wants to be the emperor, the Sapa Inca. He wants all of the Inca Empire. And so Atahualpa ordered his men, his generals, very capable, seasoned generals, to march south. And their mission, of course, conquer everything they could, conquer Cusco if they could, capture Huascar if they could. This was a complete takeover. And as they marched south, Huascar sent army after army against them north, but each of those armies was defeated in turn. He pulled out all the stops, Huascar. He recruited and conscripted and forced into his armies every able-bodied man and boy, fisherman and farmer. But it was no use. They were defeated again and again. And eventually, Atahualpa's forces, Atahualpa at this point is sitting pretty in his northern base. He sent his generals south. Atahualpa's forces eventually reach the very edge of Cusco. The fall of Huascar is imminent. Well, facing as he did an existential threat, Huascar decided that now was the time to personally enter the fray. He was going to lead his army, his greatest army, into battle personally. Now, he did this against the advice of some of his advisors, against the advice of the oracles, and he gathered together a massive force. And, every contingent in this force was wearing its traditional dress, depending on where they came from, their home country. He must have delighted in this sea of colors. Surely this would be the army that would finally, end this great rebellion. And so he marched forth against these northern aggressors, his brother's troops. And as he did so, he had the dry grass in front of the army burned. And this massive fire made its way to the enemy. And by all accounts, thousands of the northern troops actually died in the fire, perishing before the battle had even begun. It looked like Huascar had won without really having to fight. Rather than finish off the northerners, Huascar decided to celebrate that night, which allowed Atahualpa's generals to reorganize in the dark and set up an ambush, so that the next morning when Huascar entered what was supposed to be the desolation of his enemy's position, instead the trap was sprung and Huascar himself, the Sapa Inca, was captured. Huascar was thrown to the ground, dragged away, and one of Atahualpa's generals entered the Sapa Inca's royal litter and ordered that it be carried back to Huascar's camp. Very gutsy move. Well, as the litter entered the camp and Huascar's multitudinous men realized that the Sapa Inca was gone and in his place was one of Atahualpa's generals, they fled in terror in 100 different directions. They probably ran all the way home. Just like that, Huascar's grand army was no more. What followed was Huascar's ultimate nightmare. Cuzco, the imperial capital, was sacked. Its buildings and people were looted. The court records were burned and destroyed. Not written records, of course, records made of strings. They're called quipus, strings of different lengths and colors with different knots in different places. So the recorders who are trained to read them also killed. To erase history, a lot of conquerors do this. They want to erase the past. So very, very tragic. The mummy of Tupac Inca Yupanqui, whose supporters had sided with Huascar, was burned and the supporters killed if they could be found. And as for Huascar, he was dressed in women's clothing, he was forced to eat human excrement, he was tortured, and then he was forced to watch as his wives and concubines and children were slaughtered in front of him. Meanwhile, Atahualpa is marching south. He's eager to make his victorious entrance into the imperial capital of Cuzco and claim his rightful position, as he sees it, as Sapa Inca. But the empire that he has seemingly won is broken. Something like 150,000 Inca subjects have perished just in the previous few weeks. So this is quite a bloodletting, very historically significant bloodletting as it turns out. And opinion is still divided throughout the empire. Some people still support the now humiliated Huascar. Other people are supporting Atahualpa. Now the Spanish had infiltrated Inca territory before. Years earlier, a group of Spanish had landed in Inca territory and caused quite a stir here in the north with their weird floating wooden houses, their silver jackets, their sticks that spoke like thunder, their beards, their white skin. They'd sort of come ashore during the day, entered the houses of nobles. It seemed as if wild beasts couldn't harm them. And the old emperor, Huayna Capac, the previous emperor, even though he tried to meet them, they left before they could be dragged before him. So as far as we know, Huayna Capac, the previous emperor, never met a Spaniard. Now word reached miserable Cuzco that these strange foreigners had arrived again. These strange, bearded, silver-jacketed white people had arrived on their weird floating houses once again. And some people in Cuzco had been praying to Viracocha, the creator of the world. See, according to legend, Viracocha, after creating the world, had walked off across the West Sea and disappeared over the horizon. Well, people are praying for him to deliver them from the brutality of Atahualpa. And then these guys show up, these very strange, godlike creatures show up from across that same sea. And so a lot of people are saying, these guys must be sent by Viracocha here to deliver us. Now, Atahualpa, he's still marching towards Cuzco when he receives the news of the arrival of these strange foreigners. And so he decides to stop because he's curious about them. He wants to see him. So he stops to appease his own curiosity. Not to mention, he's heard rumors that these foreigners are riding dragons. Okay? Really, we're talking horses, but the Incas are wholly unfamiliar with horses. So Atahualpa, he wants to see these dragons, and if the rumors are true, he wants to acquire these dragons. He wants to steal them. And so he stops his march to accomplish these goals: curiosity and possibly the acquisition of dragons. And keep in mind, he is in control of between 30 and 80,000 troops directly around him nearby, and many, many more who are south, active in plundering and occupying Cuzco. And you know the rest. How Francisco Pizarro captured Atahualpa, ransomed him for rooms full of gold and silver, then killed him anyway, and how the Spaniards took down, it was 168 Spaniards, took down the mighty Inca Empire and its 6 million subjects. That is widely known. What is less known is that Francisco Pizarro's path was paved by a civil war, a war between the two brothers, a war that ravaged the empire, weakened it, and led to Atahualpa's having many, many enemies. Enemies which then ended up joining the Spanish against him. See, when Francisco Pizarro was marching south, he was building an army not of Spaniards, but of locals. Thousands and tens of thousands of locals, and maybe more, joined him against the Inca. Why? Well, either they hated Atahualpa because they were partisans of Huascar, or they hated the Inca generally because the Incans were conquerors. They were imperialists. A lot of these territories, particularly in the north, had been recently conquered. The Inca Empire had only been built over the last century. And a lot of these people sided with the Spanish against the Inca. Just as Hernan Cortez had relied upon tens of thousands and maybe even hundreds of thousands of locals to bring down the hated Aztecs, Pizarro relied upon thousands and tens of thousands of locals to bring down the hated Inca. Had Pizarro shown up just a few years earlier or a few years later, a few years earlier before the Civil War, a few years later after the Civil War, things probably would have turned out quite a bit differently. Instead, he showed up in the midst of conflict at a time when people are tired of the killing and marauding ways of Cusco, tired of the brutality of Atahualpa, at a time when people are praying for deliverance from across the sea. So the Inca Civil War helps explain what would otherwise be the totally baffling episode, the Spanish takeover of the Inca Empire.